What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. Today I'm going to attempt the impossible and review one of my all-time favorite movies, The Third Man, written by Graham Greene and directed by Carol Reed. The film was released on September 1st, 1949 in the UK, and then later in 1950 in the US. But in honor of its 75th anniversary, the film is getting re-released in theaters as well as a new 4K Blu-ray release. Hopefully a new generation of admirers will discover the film. But for my part, I'm old enough to remember the film's 50th anniversary back in the fall of 1999, my fourth year at the University of Virginia, a time where I was a total psychopath about studying old movies, in particular anything involving Orson Welles, who plays the infamous Harry Lime, his most popular movie role he would ever play outside of his own productions. I first discovered the film in the fall of 1995 in a class called Cinema as an Art Form, which we called Cinema as a Gut Form because it had a reputation for being a relatively easy class. But we watched The Third Man on 16mm, and I can still remember the rest of the curriculum, which included Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, A Clockwork Orange, and Full Metal Jacket, Luis Buñuel's Un Chien Andalou, Land Without Bread, The Exterminating Angel, and That Obscure Object of Desire, as well as Simon of the Desert, Federico Fellini's La Strada and Knights of Cabiria, Coppola's The Conversation, and best of all, two films directed by Orson Welles, Citizen Kane and Touch of Evil. And I have to say, that's not a bad lineup of movies at all for an introductory film class, although it must be stated, I had absolutely zero appreciation for the majority of them at that time. I remember for The Exterminating Angel, I had my arms crossed and my eyes closed, and I was trying my best, not to watch the movie because I didn't want to watch an old foreign film. Luckily, I eventually came around, and my journey into obsessing over old movies was officially underway. And the good thing was that over the next couple of years, a lot of my friends would also take that same class, Cinema as an Art Form or Cinema as a Gut Form. And so I ended up hosting screenings whenever people were preparing for their exams. So I ended up watching Citizen Kane and Touch of Evil and The Third Man and all these movies over and over and over again. And even though at age 19 I was a little bit stubborn about watching old movies, after you start watching these movies over and over again, a strange metamorphosis will often take place inside your brain. And before I knew what was happening, I was totally addicted. In any event, The Third Man quickly earned a spot in my list of top 10 favorite films of all time, and it has never fallen off because my list is always changing like a lot of people, but there are certain movies like The Wild Bunch or Touch of Evil that are always on the list no matter what. And in the years since, luckily I've had the chance to see The Third Man in the theater several times over down at the Film Forum, which is only a few blocks away from me, and all these years later, that flick can still sell out to all the maniacs and freaks out there who can basically quote the movie line by line. And that's who this video is for. It's for the fanatics. If you've never seen it, here are my only spoiler-free comments I'll make. The premise is relatively simple, and I'm ripping this straight from IMDb. Pulp novelist Holly Martins travels to shadowy post-war Vienna, only to find himself investigating the mysterious death of an old friend, Harry Lime. And that's it. And if it sounds to you like it might just be yet another conventional thriller, it very well could have been, if not for the fact that this is one of those rare genre films where the cast and the crew included so many legendary figures operating at the top of their game with such exquisite levels of craftsmanship that they ended up creating both the smash hit as well as a classic all-in-one. And when I mentioned the movie to my grandmother in the late 90s, in spite of her having not seen the film in 50 years, she immediately started humming the theme song to The Third Man. And I also think she might have had a small case of, she might have had the hots for Joseph Cotton, who grew up not too far from Richmond, Virginia, down in Petersburg. But she never confirmed nor denied her potential infatuation with the great Holly Martins.
You did tell me I ought to find myself a girl.
But with all that aside, if you've never seen the movie, bail out now, because for the rest of the video, I'm just basically going to be shining a spotlight on my favorite ingredients from the film, also sharing my favorite anecdotes about the making of the movie. And if you're already a connoisseur, you're going to find nothing new here that has not already been explored in superior fashion by writers like David Thompson or Peter Bogdanovich or Joseph McBride. And of course, my favorite Welles biographer, Simon Callow, who has written 3 volumes on Welles's career with a 4th on the way. And here's a little picture of all my physical media related to Welles. And if you're thinking to yourself that perhaps this collection's getting a little excessive, I'll simply say that of all the actors, filmmakers, and just all around great screen personas in the history of movies, I've spent more time obsessing over the ups and downs and the triumphs and failures of Orson Welles than any other filmmaker, apart from maybe Sam Peckinpah, who would be a close second. But more on Orson Welles in a little bit. Let's start at the beginning, when writer Graham Greene, director Carol Reed, and producer Alexander Korda got together and cooked up this brilliant idea and got the whole thing underway. And they were flying high off the success of their previous collaboration, The Fallen Idol, from 1948, and they were ready to get the band back together, and each of them brought a few interesting ideas to the table. It was Korda who was looking to produce a film about the four-power occupation of Vienna right after World War II, but Graham Greene had a scrap of an idea that he was eager to develop, and if you'll indulge me for a moment, here's what Greene had to say. Most novelists, I suppose, carry around in their heads or in their notebooks the first ideas for stories that have never come to be written. Sometimes one turns them over after many years and thinks regretfully that they would have been good once in a time now dead. So 20 years back, on the flap of an envelope, I had written an opening paragraph. I had paid my last farewell to Harry a week ago, when his coffin was lowered into the frozen February ground, so that it was with incredulity that I saw him pass by without a sign of recognition among the host of strangers in the Strand. And let me just interrupt the quote. That is one hell of an opening sentence, but getting back to the excerpt, I, no more than my hero, had pursued Harry, so when Sir Alexander Korda asked me to write a film for Carol Reed to follow our fallen idol, I had nothing more to offer than this paragraph. Though Korda wanted a film about the four-power occupation of Vienna, he was prepared to let me pursue the tracks of Harry there. Now, I have to pause to make a small confession. I barely know anything about Graham Greene's books. I've read one of his novels, Brighton Rock, which I read in preparation for an episode of Wrong Reel I did with Robert Amara about movies based on Graham Greene's books, and I'll include a link to Wrong Reel 533 in the description below. But getting back to The Third Man, Graham Greene cooked up a little novella as well as a screenplay for the project, but The Third Man was always intended first and foremost as a movie. And at that time, Carol Reed was a perfect fit for Graham Greene's sensibility, as can be seen in some of the brilliant sequences from Odd Man Out, Carol Reed's movie from 1947. And at this time in his career, Carol Reed just had a real eye for like wet cobblestone streets and mist around taverns and restaurants or street lamps, like all these visual flourishes which would be put to good use in The Third Man. But I should mention that in addition to the Herculean task of directing this movie and running 3 separate units at the same time and often operating on 3 hours sleep, basically for like 6 weeks in a row, he also made time in his busy schedule to record the voiceover narration which opens the movie about the political situation in Vienna in the late 40s, as well as the proliferation of the black market. And I have to say, for a guy who's more of a director than an actor, it is the stuff of genius.
I really got to know it in the classic period of the black market. We'd run anything if people wanted it enough and had the money to pay. Of course, a situation like that does tempt amateurs, but, well, they can't stay the course like a professional.
But long story short, these 3 individuals, Carol Reed, Graham Greene, and Alexander Korda, they were born to work together, and they'd all end up getting knighted at different points in their careers. But things started getting a little messier with the involvement of producer David O. Selznick, who was a total megalomaniac thanks to the success of Gone with the Wind. But he did have some incredible actors under contract at that time, which is where this movie starts to bloom. Now, like a lot of powerful producers, David O. Selznick was a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the good and the bad that he brought to the table. When it comes to the bad, I'd say that he disagreed with Carol Reed about the ending, but to be fair, Carol Reed also disagreed with Graham Greene about the ending. Carol Reed's probably, one of his many contributions to the movie is giving it that bleak, bittersweet ending, which I think ranks as one of the all-time great endings to any movie from any era. So, yeah, I'm on Carol Reed's side here. But what David Selznick definitely did, which I disapprove of, when the film got released in America, he replaced the opening narration with narration read by Joseph Cotten, since Joseph Cotten obviously would be familiar to American audiences. And he also cut about 11 minutes from the movie, so shame on you, David O. Selznick, to making any changes to this more or less like perfect film in my eyes. And famously, David O. Selznick did not want Orson Welles anywhere near this movie and recommended a whole host of other actors, including Robert Mitchum. But Robert Mitchum had a little problem with being in jail for being busted for marijuana possession. Long story short, Carol Reed and Alexander Korda both really wanted Orson Welles, and they knew he would bring something really special to the table. And obviously, they proved to be right in the long term. But David O. Selznick, he basically did everything in his power to prevent Orson Welles from appearing in this movie. So anyway, he brought some good stuff to the table, like Joseph Cotten, but he also created a lot of obstacles. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read a little excerpt from One Man Band by Simon Callow. Simon Callow is my favorite Welles biographer, and once again, he's written 3 books. He's got a 4th on the way, which is supposed to come out later next year. But he had this to say about the debate over Welles's involvement. David O. Selznick was bitterly opposed to Welles's involvement from the beginning. Cary Grant, Noel Coward, and David Niven had already been proposed as alternatives. Finally, when the 2 central male characters were reconceived as Americans, Robert Mitchum was keenly championed as a line by Selznick. Welles was saved by the bell on that one when Mitchum, one of America's top grossers, was arrested for possession of marijuana. Though Selznick continued to insist that casting Welles would be a detriment to the picture, he was box office poisoned. Specially commissioned Gallup polls had proved it. While I do not profess knowing as much as Mr. Gallup about box office values, replied recorder, and the same feline tone he deployed when dealing with his pesky American running mate. I cannot believe I'm being a detriment. Carol thinks Orson could give a tremendous performance in this part. Picture greatly depends on Lime being extraordinary in attraction and superior in intellect. And I found this little note over on IMDb where it says, during meetings between Graham Greene and Sir Carol Reed and David O. Selznick, Greene was less than impressed with Selznick, who had, according to Selznick's own son, become something of a parody of himself. Greene later mocked Selznick's dependency at that stage on the drug Benzedrine, better known as speed. Reed also became hooked on Benzedrine while shooting the time-consuming film. Both Reed and Selznick were operating on as little as 2 hours of sleep a day. And I don't know about y'all, but I've never experimented with Benzedrine. I don't really know what the effects are, but I do know that in the late 30s and early 40s, one of the ways that Orson Welles was able to do all those plays and all those radio shows like all at the same time was he had a pretty healthy Benzedrine habit as well. I don't even know what the hell Benzedrine is made of, but apparently there's a lot of Benzedrine on the set of The Third Man, but maybe it's time for me to unpack one of my favorite ingredients of this movie, and that's the relationship and the history between Joseph Cotten and Orson Welles. And here, Joseph Cotten, I think, he might be playing like my favorite bumbling American in American history. He's a drunken scribbler of cheap novelettes who basically finds himself up to his ears in every kind of trouble imaginable. And I love how throughout the movie he basically approaches each twist and turn like he's one of the characters in his books. And there's this incredible ongoing commentary throughout the movie from different characters about like the quality or the lack thereof of his writing. Like toward the end of the movie when Trevor Howard just kind of dismissively says, I never knew there were snake charmers in Texas. And like meanwhile Joseph Cotten is stewing over these horrifying revelations that he's just been exposed to. But there's something amazing about how Joseph Cotten is like, I think they describe him as being happy as a lark without a penny to his name.
Anyway, there he was, poor chap. Happy as a lark and without a cent.
And he suddenly finds himself in this international espionage thriller of basically like the gist of the plot is these people are stealing penicillin from hospitals, diluting it, and then selling it in order to make it go further. And as a result, people who have gangrene legs or kids with meningitis are having all these horrible side effects, oftentimes fatal, due to using the diluted penicillin. And so slowly but surely, Joseph Cotten comes to the realization that his friend is not that nice a guy, and maybe it's time for him to...
Kaput.
But with any movie involving both Joseph Cotten as well as Orson Welles, there's a tendency amongst some Welles fanatics to basically look at the characters they're playing as well as the movie they're in as a reflection or an extension of their own relationship. And I've got a bad habit of basically any myth, any legend, any piece of gossip about Joseph Cotten and Orson Welles, as long as it's entertaining, I'm willing to at least consider that it's potentially true. And I've read a lot of different biographies of these guys over the years. And there's no shortage of incredible stories about these two guys who basically approached each project like they were like naughty little boys trying to see like how much could they get away with before their parents gave them like, a slap on the wrist for their antics. But when you think about all the plays that they did together and all the radio shows and all the incredible movies that they worked on, I mean, just the movies alone where you've got Citizen Kane and obviously Orson directed Joseph Cotten and the Magnificent Ambersons, and then Joseph Cotten has a little cameo in Touch of Evil.
I'd like to meet him. That's what you think.
Even as a little cameo in F for Fake, I mean, they knew each other for decades. But here, much like in Citizen Kane, the two characters that play there, the two characters they play here do seem to reflect some of their rivalries as well as their friendship, as well as some of the insecurities that might have existed between the two actors. And if you'll indulge me, one more passage from One Man Band by Simon Callow. There's an interesting passage about Joseph Cotten's perspective on Orson Welles after a particularly bad day of shooting where Orson had been struggling to deliver his lines in a satisfactory way. But that evening, Montague asked Cotten what the problem was. Cotten traced it back to their days together at the Mercury Theater when he said, Welles had a kind of inferiority complex when acting, especially with me. There was no question, he said, that Welles was one of the greatest directors of all time, but he was uncertain of himself as an actor, and he knows that I know that. This interesting complication in the relationship between the two friends deeply informs their performances in The Third Man, as it had in Citizen Kane. The idea of betrayal, so familiar in Welles's films, is nowhere more brilliantly expressed than in his performance in Greene's Deeply Uneasy story. It hangs in the air between the two men. Welles knows that I know. But ever since I started getting into these movies, both in Citizen Kane as well as in The Third Man, I love watching these two actors interact because you get the sense that at one time they were like thick as thieves, where everything seemed like so much fun, like there was nothing they couldn't get away with. But now there's come a point where they are disillusioned or bitter or resentful, or they're having a falling out.
Don't try to be a policeman, old man.
What do you expect me to be? Part of
All right,
your...
you can have any parts you want as long as you don't interfere. I've never cut you out of anything. I remember when they raided the gambling joint, you knew a safe way out.
Sure.
Yeah, safe for you, not safe for me.
And there's something about, like, having the history of Citizen Kane only 8 years before this movie adds additional emotional resonance to the scenes in The Third Man, where it seems like Joseph Cotton's characters are always stuck with watching the fall from grace of their closest friend. And he also plays kind of a sad drunk in both movies.
I'm drunk.
And what makes it even more surreal is when they have certain lines in their scenes that seem to almost offer a commentary on their own lives, like when Harry Lime's talking about being free of income tax.
If I offered you 20,000 pounds for every dot that stopped, would you really, old man, tell me to keep my money? Or would you calculate how many dots you could afford to spend? Free of income tax, old man. Free of income tax. The only way you can save money nowadays.
And perhaps due to all this history and all this chemistry, maybe that's why Orson's able to give his best performance outside of his own movies in this movie. Very rarely did he deliver great performances to other filmmakers. Like, some of the exceptions would be movies like Compulsion or his role in Moby Dick for John Huston. Like, he was capable of good performances for other directors, but he tended to do his best performances in his own movies, Citizen Kane, Touch of Evil, Chimes at Midnight, and things like that. But I think never was he more natural and more vicious and less self-conscious than in this movie, when he's talking about, like, you know, like, if I were to, like, look at all those dots down below, if I were to offer you 20,000 pounds for each dot that stopped moving, would you really tell me to keep my money? I mean, it's some really evil, diabolical stuff, but it's also incredibly sad watching these two legends, these two old friends, face to face, eyeball to eyeball at the very end of the movie, where basically Holly Martins is forced to kill his oldest friend, but also he's putting him out of his misery. I mean, at this point, the crimes of Harry Lime are unforgivable. I think one of the most emotionally impactful scenes of the whole movie, everything's suggested off screen, but Holly's taken to a hospital where we're just seeing his face looking down at these children that have been victims of some of Harry Lime's penicillin, and it's pretty grim stuff. I think no matter how charming and debonair and, like, you know, charismatic Orson Welles might be in this role, once you start to get a sense of all the evil and harm that he's done, like, we're all ready to see him go bye-bye, especially after he shoots Bernard Lee, a.k.a. M from the future James Bond franchise, but more about Bernard Lee in a second.
Hey, come back!
But speaking of sadness, nobody was more sad than Orson Welles when he made the wrong deal for this film. At this time, Orson was shooting Othello, a film which he would shoot a bit, he'd break the crew up, then he'd shoot a bit, he'd break the crew up. He basically was going off and doing acting gigs in order to finance his big passion project. And because he needed money now and desperately, he agreed to be paid up front as opposed to getting a piece of the action. And one of my other favorite film historians, David Thompson, has this great passage where he writes, "He felt like master of the hunt, but he was stupid when the deal was done. He was offered $100,000 up front for a few days' work, or 20% of the picture's profit. There was never a glimmer of the businessman in Wells, no real respect for profit. He took the cash, and he never worked on a bigger hit." I mean, Orson had money problems his entire life. He liked to be paid in cash on his movies because he owed so many back taxes and so much alimony. His personal life, like the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, was a complete and total fucking train wreck, and so he always needed money up front. In any case, this is one of those situations where, because he needed money desperately for Othello, he made the wrong deal on The Third Man. And The Third Man is the kind of, you know, sexy genre film, crime film hit that Orson was always trying to reach for with certain movies like Touch of Evil or movies like The Stranger, but he was never quite able to pull off. But luckily, he was able to direct some future installments related to Harry Lime, but we'll get to that at the end of the video. But in the late 60s, Orson Welles sat down with Peter Bogdanovich for a series of interviews about his career, and he drew attention to one of the key ingredients as to why the character of Harry Lime is so popular. And I strongly recommend everybody hunt down the book, This is Orson Welles. This is actually my third copy of the book. Anytime I lend it to somebody, they end up stealing the fucking thing, but I'd love to get my original back, because in college I read it over and over and over again, and had all my underlined passages, and any of it. I'm glad I still have it. But he talked about how there was some old story with a character called Mr. Wu, where for the first 2/3 of the story, everybody keeps saying, "Oh, when will Mr. Wu arrive?" and so on and so forth. And at the very end of the first act, he shows up, and then the curtain drops down, and it's intermission. Everybody's like, "Oh my God, like, isn't that guy like a great actor?" It helps quite a bit in The Third Man, where the entire movie, everybody's making references to The Third Man. The Third Man is mentioned twice in the story from different characters, like there was a third man.
Say, there was a third man. He didn't give evidence.
You don't mean the doctor?
No. He came later.
Or when Joseph Cotton or Holly Martins describes how he's working on a new book called The Third Man.
Is Mr. Martins engaged on a new book?
Yes. It's called The Third Man.
A novel, Mr. Martins?
It's a murder story. I've just started it.
But if you spend 2/3 of a movie saying, like, who is the third man, who is Harry Lime, blah, 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 when you finally show up in one of the all-time great character intros, I mean, the whole audience is going to gasp. But I can remember seeing this movie back in 2015. They were doing the 100th birthday celebration at the Film Forum, where they're showing anything and everything involving Orson Welles. Movies he'd appeared in, movies he directed, even documentaries. It was just like a month-long extravaganza about Orson Welles. But that scene where the light comes out of the window and reveals Harry Lime in the doorway still got an audible gasp from the audience. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I'm surrounded by my people, all my fellow Welles junkies. And we are junkies. Like, there's something, like, I often say that I'm so fascinated by the career of Orson Welles that I almost can't talk about it. And I think the only reason I'm able to talk about it right now is that he's got 11 minutes of footage in this film. It's a relatively small part in comparison to the rest of the movie, but I can discuss Welles' career if I break it off into little 11-minute chunks. And as I showed you in that picture earlier from a physical media library, I've amassed a little bit of a collection of books on his career, as well as all of his various feature films, both on DVD and Blu-ray. I am due to get a Blu-ray for The Third Man, but I tried buying one recently. Something happened when Criterion Collection put out the Blu-ray where they immediately lost the rights to it afterwards, and so now those Blu-rays have become major collector's items. So they cost like several $100s. Like, I love Orson Welles, but I'm not going to spend several $100s on a goddamn Blu-ray. I'll wait for the next Blu-ray release. And speaking of my collection of Orson Welles stuff, I should pause to show y'all this. A painting by, or not a painting, an illustration by Tony Stella, which I have prominently displayed in my bedroom because I'm a big, giant freak for Orson Welles' career. But yeah, I had to take that fucker down from my wall just to show it off in this video. But thank you, Tony. That's a fantastic poster. But as much as I might have love and affection for my fellow Welles fanatics out there, I must also acknowledge that amongst the Welles fanatics or the Welles community, there are a few people out there, well, let's just say they go to the dark side, where they tend to embellish his achievements, and nowhere more so than with The Third Man. I remember one of my first big Twitter fights, like 10 years ago, was when somebody basically said just by exuding his aura, somehow he deserved credit for directing the movie. But just to set the record straight, before Welles had even signed his contract to be in the movie was already being shot, and he was in Vienna for a week, and he was in the UK for a week when they were shooting in the studio. And there's a long history of this where some of Welles' admirers in the 50s and 60s were almost trying to, like, tease out of Welles, like, did you have any ideas for shots on the set? Or like, why does this movie look so unusual compared to some of Carol Reed's other movies? I would say, well, those people have not seen Odd Man Out, or they would recognize that it was not a new thing to shoot movies this way, apart from perhaps some of the Dutch angles, but more on the Dutch angles in a second. And Welles, as much as I love and adore him, there are a few times throughout the 1950s where he was so closely identified with the character of Harry Lime, where when people were talking about this movie, he might have suggested or hinted that he had more creative contributions, apart from just that brilliant bit of showmanship where he added that great speech about cuckoo clocks.
Well, what the fella said. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Holly.
But a few years later, or many years later, he started to feel a little guilty about some of the things that he said. So he set the record straight when he was talking to Peter Bogdanovich, and this is all included in This is Orson Welles, boom, 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 where Peter Bogdanovich asks, did you have anything to do with the actual setups and shots in the picture? Orson Welles says, just a very few ideas like the fingers coming through the grill. What about the first time we see you in the doorway? Pure Carol. He had a little second unit specially set up for it, and at the end of every day we went there and tried it again over and over until we thought it was right. Was the last scene at the funeral your touch? No, it was not. It was a great shot invented by Carol, not by Greene or anybody else. Wonderful idea. I was there when they shot it. I wish I could pretend I'd contributed, but I was just standing there watching them shoot it. Then Peter says, the picture seemed to be influenced by you, perhaps because of the casting of Joseph Cotton. To which Orson replies, it was Carol's picture, Peter, and Corda. So there it is, straight from his mouth. But there's one area where director Carol Reed, writer Graham Greene, and star Orson Welles are all in agreement. He did contribute that bit about the cuckoo clocks during the Ferris wheel scene, but even he admitted there was a scrap of that which he couldn't quite remember which play he was lifting it from, like some Hungarian play. And also, if you look at it closely, or at least listen to it closely, he was called out on the fact that the Swiss do not make cuckoo clocks. They actually come from Bavaria. So his most famous contribution is historically inaccurate, but you know that is some world-class screenwriting, and it's the best bit of dialogue in the entire movie. But maybe I should press pause on the subject of Orson Welles and talk about some of the other ingredients in this movie. Let's talk about Vienna. Vienna is a character in this movie. It's only a few years after World War II. There's rubble everywhere. Everybody's, cash-strapped. And I love how it's just this incredible environment where everybody seems to be part of the black market. One of the most brilliant little bits of dialogue in the entire movie is one point one of the villains offers a cigarette to the character played by Alida Valli. And after she takes a smoke, he says, "Keep the pack."
Cigarette, Schmidt?
Ja, danke.
Keeps a pack.
And there's something about that, it tells you so much about this world where commodities and things you can trade and things you can barter are more important than anything else. Like, life is cheap in Vienna at this time. Or even earlier in the movie, she makes a reference to the fact that after her performances, sometimes people will throw things like tea instead of flowers to the actresses because everybody's so broke. Tea is useful, flowers less so. But it's one of the best environments for a crime thriller ever conceived by human beings. What helps bring it all to life is director of photography Robert Krasker, where he delivers some of the best black and white photography that we have ever seen, where just like the wet cobblestones, the mist, the street lamps, it's just so fucking beautiful. And the Dutch angles are some of the best in movie history. And some of these oblique angles are more subtle than others. Sometimes they're pretty extreme, but they're pretty much scattered throughout the movie. And they always make you, as well as the character of Holly Martins, feel a little bit off balance. Like, this whole world is just a big giant labyrinth. If you walk through the wrong door, you might be in the most horrifying tunnel imaginable or a crazy spiral staircase. It's just this big giant labyrinth, this giant maze. And it just seems like Holly Martins, he just kind of bumbles from one scenario to another. And oftentimes he has no idea what the hell is going on. At one point, Alida Valli's character asked him, like, "Are the police chasing you?" He's like, "I don't know." I mean, it helps that he's always hammered throughout like half the movie.
I thought you were going to keep away. Are the police after you?
I don't know.
You're drunk, aren't you?
A bit. Sorry.
And this incredible cityscape is used to the movie's advantage in one scene after another. There's so many great chase scenes. Like, we have the first chase scene where this little boy basically identifies Holly Martins as the possible killer of one of the porters in the building, and you have this little boy with a ball and all these people, like this angry mob, walking after Holly Martins as he's trying to escape. You have the other scene where he gets thrown into a taxi cab and he thinks he's being taken off to his doom, and as it turns out, he's being delivered to this ridiculous speech that he's agreed to make. Like, one of the reasons he's able to stay in Vienna when he's broke is that he's agreed to give a speech on the modern novel. And you kind of like, you forget about that scene for the time being. And by the time he's in that cab being like blasted through the streets of Vienna, like, oh my God, are they going to like beat him up? Are they going to kill him? Are they going to throw him in the sewer? Like, what's going to happen? And then he gets out of the car and they're like, "Oh, Mr. Martins, we thought like you weren't going to make it."
Ah, Mr. Martins, what a relief to see you. I was beginning to think something had happened to you. Come along, Mr. Martins, everything's ready for you.
It is so fucking funny, and it allows the audience a chance to kind of exhale and relax and realize, oh my God, like this whole thing is meant to be fun. Don't take it too seriously. And just seeing him bullshitting and bluffing his way through this speech, it's like every kid can relate to somebody who's having to do a homework assignment or take an exam when they've done zero preparation of any kind. But the beautiful thing is how it transitions into yet another chase scene where he gets bitten by a parrot and he's hiding amidst all the rubble. It's just fantastic stuff. And of course, obviously, the sewer chase at the end ranks as one of the greatest scenes in movie history. But of course, the flavor of Vienna, the personality of Vienna would not be the same if not for the music of Anton Karas. You know what? I've never actually said his name out loud in conversation. I don't know if it's Karas or Karas. Anyway, Anton Karas, the zither player. And there are a bunch of stories about how he was discovered and how he came to be the sole contributor to the score of this movie. And I'm just going to share a few of those stories, like assistant director Guy Hamilton, who would later direct some James Bond films. But we'll get back to Guy Hamilton and James Bond in a sec. But according to Guy Hamilton, he says Reed met Karras by coincidence at a party in Vienna where he was playing the zither. Reed brought Karras to London, where the musician worked with Reed on the score for 6 weeks. Karras stayed at Reed's house during that time. Yet another story is that Sir Carol Reed discovered musician Anton Karras was scouring Vienna bars and nightclubs. Reed actually heard Karras playing at a production party and insisted that the Austrian zither player come to Reed's hotel room and record songs to use for their contract. Later in production, Reed realized he wanted to use Karras' music for the whole film and flew Karras out to London to record the score. Anton Karras became a top-selling musician thanks to the film and opened a nightclub called The Third Man in Vienna, which he ran until the end of his days. But no matter which stories you choose to believe about his involvement in the film, what cannot be denied is that the Third Man theme was a smash. Apparently, it was released as a single in 1949 in the UK, and then later in the US and became a bestseller. By November of 1949, 300,000 records had been sold in Britain, with the teenage Princess Margaret a reported fan. And admittedly, the Third Man theme is fucking classic. That the opening credits sequence where you're just seeing the zither and hearing the music, it's iconic. But it's not the only music he contributed to this film. There's so much beautiful expressiveness, or there's such an incredible expressive quality to his music that doesn't necessarily tell you how to think, but gives you at least one alternative of how to respond emotionally to certain scenes, like the long build-up when Alita Valley's walking out of the film at the end. And it's just like the big, slow build. It's just so sad and so melancholy. Or moments where somebody's about to be killed and they turn toward the camera and it's like bling, 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 bling. I mean, just it'll really kick in. Anyway, it's one of the all-time great themes. And I feel like the score for this movie, it's so intimately or so like intricately interwoven with the rest of the film, the movie cannot exist without it. But I mentioned earlier my fondness for all the oblique and Dutch angles scattered throughout the movie, where the camera's kind of tilted to one side, just making the whole world seem a little more otherworldly. But apparently, after seeing the movie, famed director William Wyler, who sadly doesn't get discussed all that much these days, but in the 1940s was a major director, but he was a friend of Sir Carol Reed, apparently sent him a spirit level with a note. Carol, next time you make a picture, just put it on top of the camera, will you? Obviously, it's having a bit of fun, like, you know, I think I always love it when people give you praise and affection by talking a little bit of shit, and obviously William Wyler and Carol Reed were both in their prime in the 1940s, and I think it's natural that they would have a friendly rivalry. But Carol Reed, he just he basically broke himself physically making this movie. I love how he was running a daytime unit, a nighttime unit, and a sewer unit all simultaneously, which had him working 20-hour days. I don't quite know how he pulled it off, but then again, just need a lot of drugs and a lot of focus and a lot of patience and a lot of powers of concentration. You can kind of keep it all more or less under control. But as I was rewatching this movie yesterday, I'd kind of forgotten just how much interconnectivity there is between this movie and the future James Bond franchise in terms of directors and cast and influence. Like, the influence of this, or the shadow of this movie, is profound, and it's a very influential movie. But let's start with the legendary Bernard Lee, who plays Sergeant Payne. I mean, he's phenomenal throughout this. And of course, he's Holly Martin's biggest fan.
I'm so glad to have met you, sir. I've read quite a few of your books.
Auf Wiedersehen, Herr.
I like a good Western. That's what I like about them, sir. You can pick them up and put them down any time.
It's like a backhanded compliment where he constantly is like praising Holly Martin's books and saying things that are inadvertently dismissive. Like, oh, you can pick them up and put them down anytime. And it's like he's trying to be nice, but he's actually saying like your books are disposable trash. But he's got an incredible role in this movie. And I think his death scene toward the end of the movie is one of the things that helps turn the audience against Harry Lime and allows them to accept the fact that the most charming person in the movie has got to go. But of course, later on, Bernard Lee would play M in I don't know how many Bond films. Let's look it up real quick. How many times? I'm going to guess he played it 8 times. How many times did Bernard Lee play M?
I've used the Beretta for 10 years. I've never missed with a jet.
Yeah, maybe not. But it jammed on your last job, and you spent 6 months in hospital in consequence. If you carry a 00 number, it means you're licensed to kill, not get killed.
11 Bond movies, and I think he was better in the earlier Bond movies, but still 11 Bond movies. But yeah, Bernard Lee, he's the only M that I will ever need in my life. But it's not the only connection between The Third Man and the James Bond franchise, because Guy Hamilton, the assistant director on this movie, he directed 4 James Bond movies, including Goldfinger. And then we have John Glenn, who was working in the editing department at the time. He would later direct 5 Bond movies, including the first James Bond film that I ever saw, For Your Eyes Only. And then we have actor Jeffrey Keane, who is absolutely hilarious in The Third Man. But if you blink, you will miss him. But he has a great little line.
I'm sorry, miss. It's orders. We can't go against the protocol.
I don't even know what protocol means.
None at all, miss.
But then later, he would play British Defense Minister Sir Frederick Grey in 6 Bond movies, including The Spy Who Loved Me, as well as perhaps most notoriously in Moonraker, which has perhaps the most scandalous ending of all the Bond movies.
007.
My God, what's Bond doing?
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
But I can't believe I've gotten this far talking about James Bond and the Third Man without mentioning that Orson Welles was the original actor who played Le Chiffre in Casino Royale back in 1967. But getting back to the movie, I can't believe I've gotten this far without giving adequate praise to the great Trevor Howard. Trevor Howard is just one of those great legends of British movies. I think perhaps he was best in Brief Encounter from director David Lean, but goddamn, as Calloway here, he's incredible. And I love how this is an ongoing bit where Joseph Cotton, usually in a state of drunkenness, will always call him Callahan. He's like, no, it's Calloway. I'm English, not Irish.
Listen, Callahan.
Calloway, I'm English, not Irish.
You're not going to close your files at a dead man's expense.
So you're going to find me the real criminal. Sounds like one of your stories.
But he's got so many great lines scattered throughout the movie, like leave death to the professionals. That's fantastic. Or when Holly Martins is trying to explain how he got bitten on the finger by a parrot.
What's the matter with your hand?
Parrot bit me.
Oh, stop behaving like a fool, Martins.
His withering disdain and like dismissive attitude towards Holly Martin the entire movie, because throughout the movie Holly Martins is always trying to like throw his weight around like he's once again like he's a character in one of his books. And he just comes across as such a clown at each and every opportunity, but a lovable clown. Like, you can't help but root for him, because I think we can all relate to being Holly Martins, especially if you're an American in a foreign land where you don't quite have, you're not quite on firm footing when it comes to understanding the environment around you.
Who are you looking for now?
Don't, please.
And there's also so much lovable Britishness to this movie, if that's even a word. Like, I think of it as an international thriller, but the humor is very English. Like, at one point when Holly Martins is explaining to Crabbin, played by Wilfred Hyde White, that is he's come to Vienna, but his friend is dead, and Crabbin just says, "Oh goodness, that's awkward." And he's like, "That's what you say to people? Like, goodness, that's awkward."
Heard of Harry Lime?
Well, I've heard of him, of course, but I didn't exactly know him.
I was going to stay with him, but he died Thursday.
Goodness, that's awkward.
That what you say to people after death? Goodness, that's awkward.
Because on one hand, it's very English to say, "Oh goodness, that's awkward," but it also shows how everybody has dealt with so much death and so much destruction from World War II. People can't get but so worked up about each and every single death that they hear about. Or when somebody hears about how somebody's died and they're about to be buried, like, they'll say, "Oh, it's like, it's very cold outside. It's going to be tough work on the grave diggers." Everybody's seen so much death at this point. They have a very casual attitude about death. But getting back to the whole British thing, there are all these great contrasts between, like, selling gasoline on the black market versus selling petrol. Like, no American would ever say selling petrol, but it's just constantly drawing these distinctions between Trevor Howard's character and Joseph Cotton's character that I find delightful.
Been shaking your cap and bells all over town.
Payne, get me the Harry Lime file and get Mr. Martins a large whiskey.
I don't need your drinks, Calloway.
You will.
But in the end, I guess what I love most about this movie is just the astonishing visual storytelling. As great as the screenplay is, as great as the acting is, like, movies are nothing if you don't have great visual storytelling. Like when Holly's being driven through the streets of Vienna in that ride to the meeting that he's forgotten about, how it keeps cutting away to all these strange figures looking at it going by, and they have so much personality and so much texture to their faces. And it was a tactic that was used beforehand in Odd Man Out as well. Carol Reed absolutely knew what he was doing. Or there are all these great little montages in there. Like at one point when one of the villains says, "Everybody ought to go careful in a city like Vienna," and then it transitions into this astonishing little montage as all of Harry Lime's cronies are meeting together on this with this mysterious figure. But we see how, like, Dr. Winkle's getting his bicycle and going out. It's just great visual storytelling with just music and images, and that's all you need. But maybe just as a way of wrapping things up, let's talk about the legacy of this movie, the aftermath, because obviously it was a hit. It's a beloved film. I mean, 75 years later, people are still ranting and raving about it. But even though Orson Welles did not get a piece of the action, just got paid up front, he did get future work as a result of this movie, which led to the British radio series. It was called The Adventures of Harry Lime and The Lives of Harry Lime, depending upon which territory you're in. I don't know which one was British and which one was American, but they're fantastic. Orson was hired to star in these and direct these, and some of the episodes open up with a little voiceover narration describing like the events of the third man. And how
Harry Lime had many lives, and I can recount all of them. How do I know? It's very simple. Because my name is Harry Lime.
he knows he's already died in the movie, but he's going to talk about his early days. And apparently the person who hired Orson Welles to do this, he'd bought the rights from Graham Greene, but he was a smut peddler and a future, or at least alleged, Soviet spy, but his name was Harry Allen Towers. But yeah, Graham Greene did not hang on to the rights of Harry Lime for very long. But all these episodes are readily available on YouTube, and if you love the character of Harry Lime, well, then definitely hunt them down. But for diehard Orson Welles fanatics, there's an interesting bit of connective tissue between the adventures of Harry Lime and his future movie, Mr. Arkadin, because there's an episode called Man of Mystery, which is basically the entire story of Mr. Arkadin there in one, where in this case, it's Harry Lime, not, what the hell's the name of the character in the movie? Eventually, the character would be called Guy Van Straten, but originally, Harry Lime is hired by Gregory Arkadin to investigate his history and figure out where he comes from. Arkadin is pretending to be an amnesiac. He doesn't know who he is or how he became so successful, but basically what he's basically using Harry Lime to look up some of his old cronies so that he can have them killed. But the entire story of Mr. Arkadin is right there in that episode of The Lives of Harry Lime. So, yeah, it's funny how people these days talk about shared universes in Marvel and that sort of thing. But between The Third Man, the Lives of Harry Lime, and Mr. Arkadin, Orson Welles was 70 years ahead of the game, creating his own shared universe, even though Mr. Arkadin was a biblical level failure, to put it mildly, as well as a very troubled production where he lost control over the film. But as I was listening to it, the emotions were a little bittersweet, because if you're a fan of Welles, it's a finite resource when it comes to the number of movies he directed or the movies he appeared in or the shows that he was a part of. And it's like each time you listen to something or watch something you have not seen before, you realize the list of things left to be discovered gets ever smaller. However, I do recommend people hunt that down. But let's talk about some of the fans or some of the enduring popularity of this movie. Apparently, Martin Scorsese was a big fan of this movie back in the day, and he wrote a thesis on it while in film school, but he only got a B+ for his paper because his tutor said, forget it, it's just a thriller. So it shows how, some people are dismissive of thrillers and horror films, even when they are directed by Carol Reed and written by Graham Greene. And also, apparently in Vienna, to the present day, this movie has a permanent slot in one of the movie's oldest cinemas. It plays 3 times a week in the famous Burkino Theater. I don't know if that's still the case or not, but that's something I read either on IMDb or Wikipedia. But just as a way of wrapping up this video, I want to close this video with a quote by Walker Percy from his book, The Moviegoer. I read The Moviegoer like 25 years ago, but if you are a movie freak and want to read a great novel about just cinemania, The Moviegoer is screaming your name. But there's a passage which reads, other people, so I have read, treasure memorable moments from their lives. The time they climbed the Parthenon at sunrise, the summer night one met a lonely girl in Central Park and achieved with her a sweet and natural relationship, as they say in books. I too once met a girl in Central Park, but it's not much to remember. What I remember is the time John Wayne killed 3 men with a carbine as he was falling through the dusty street in Stagecoach, and the time the kitten found Orson Welles in the doorway in The Third Man. And I also, too, fondly remember that scene where the kitten finds Orson in the doorway, because in that scene, Joseph Cotton's trying to interact with the cat, and the cat doesn't like him. And as Alita Valley says, the cat only likes Harry. And then the cat leaves, and we kind of forget about it, but the camera pushes out the window through these plants, and you see the cat walking along the street, finds the doorway, finds these shoes, starts playing with the shoelaces, and looks up at him, and you're like, oh my God, that's Harry. And it's right before the big reveal. So, yeah, it's long before the light reveals Harry Lime in the doorway. It's the kitten that finds him first. And I don't think there's going to be a better kind of poetic image or scene to wrap up this video with. So thank you so much for sticking with me on this rambling journey through the film. If people like it, I will gladly continue to kind of break off pieces of Orson Welles' career. It's too big, and I'm too obsessed to do it all in one big video. It would take me like 50 fucking hours. I'd have to do an entire series of documentaries. But I think I can start discussing his career on this channel if I break it off a piece at a time. So we'll look at the calendar and see what other anniversaries for his movies might be over the next horizon. But what you can definitely count on with this channel in the future is I'm going to do a lot more 50th anniversary reviews, 75th anniversary reviews, and even a few 100th anniversary reviews, because we're getting into the period of the 1920s where there are a lot of really good movies being made by Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton and Erich von Stroheim and all those luminaries. So I love talking about old movies. This channel will never be devoted exclusively to old movies, because I feel like we have to wrestle with and kind of, confront the times in which we live, whether those are good, bad, or mediocre. So obviously I'm going to continue to discuss new movies, box office, etc., but I relish each and every opportunity to go back and talk about the great legendary movies of the past. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.